Welcome to the Indie Beacon Show, where readers can discover great new books by indie authors. Your hostess for today's show is Charlotte Cannon. We do hope you enjoyed today's show.
Hi, I'm your host, Charlotte Canion, award-winning author and speaker. And today our guest is Kathryn Hauisen. I think I got close, maybe not on it. She's the author of the book, The Mayflower Chronicles. She also has extensive background in public relations and writing for magazine and newspapers. Welcome to the show, Kathryn.
Thank you. It's really my pleasure to be here with you.
Kathryn, before we dig into your book and other interesting items, can you give us a little bit of your background, like where you were raised and some of your family?
I was raised mostly in the Cleveland area. We had moved several times before I started school. And then my mother put her foot down and said, we're done moving. We're going back to Cleveland, and my dad can come home when he can get there. He was a civil engineer and he had many assignments all over the place. So I grew up mostly in Cleveland. And my mother was a reference librarian, so I spent a lot of my time in libraries. I come from a family of readers. I spent a lot of my childhood reading because I was the only girl on the block, and I couldn't get to my girlfriends' homes without adult intervention. So when they weren't willing to take me, I was often home reading. I had a pretty good childhood. I grew up along Lake Erie. I spent a lot of time by and in that lake. So I loved water and all things affiliated with it. I grew up near both sets of grandparents. So I was very fortunate as a child that I spent a lot of time with my grandparents and aunts and uncles and extended family.
Oh, that is good. I didn't live near my grandparents, so it was not an advantage. Uh, do you have any siblings, or were you an only child? I didn't.
I'm the only daughter and a middle child, so that has some interesting dynamics. My older brother was 6 years older than me. There was a miscarriage between him and myself, and then I have a younger brother who was 18 months younger. My younger brother and I continue to be really very close, although we live on opposite ends of the country. He's still in Ohio. I'm now in Texas. My older brother died a couple of years ago. Neither one of them had children, so there are no cousins on that side of the family. I have a couple of cousins from my mother's side of the family, first cousins, but they have both died now. So we're a small family. We're small and we're scattered.
And you're scattered. Well, I do have some relatives up in Dayton, Ohio, so I do know that because I'm from Arkansas.
Oh,
yeah. So let's dive into, you wrote a book called The Mayflower Chronicles, and I'm assuming, we all know about, the Mayflower and, the Pinta, all the three ships and all of that. Tell us a little bit of why you got into, writing the Mayflower. Was it part of your reading as you were a child that intrigued you on that?
No, it was my mother's influence. She was a reference librarian, and she spent her early retirement years doing the research to document that we are descended from William and Mary Brewster, who were on that ship. And I grew up knowing that, and I inherited my mother's research notes, but I really didn't do much with it until my adult years, when my oldest daughter married into a large Latino family here in Texas. And I learned that her husband's family, his father in particular, has a fairly significant percentage of Native American heritage. And so because we share these grandchildren in common, I have spent a lot of time with that family and have seen American history through a different lens than the one I grew up with. So that got me really curious about, well, what was the Thanksgiving story like for the Native Americans? I mean, we've all heard the traditional version of it. But I started digging around and doing the research, and I learned that there was just an awful lot we were just not taught. The first discovery I made that really impacted my thinking was the fact that the Brewsters had 5 children, and when they sailed on the Mayflower, they only brought the younger 2 boys. So they left 2 daughters who were older teenagers and a young adult son behind, not in England where they're from, but in Holland, where they had been living in exile for about a decade. And that just crushed my heart. I mean, she didn't know if she'd ever see her daughters again or not. So then I started just really probing and digging and realized what we have been told about that story is really truncated and not always all that accurate.
Well, I think that's with a lot of stories, and I appreciate people like you that dig into it and get a little more about it. Well, when did you start writing it? You said you got your mother's notes, and then you did some research. Was it 20 years ago? Was it 15 years
Yeah,
ago? What is it? 2
it
years
was
ago?
probably a decade ago or so. I started playing around with several different approaches, and I didn't really have one that I liked. But about 7 years ago now, I suppose, I had a little bit of time between things. And so I found a writer's retreat to go to out in Vermont, took my ideas for this book and what I had so far to that retreat and got some help from the people who run the retreat. And then life got busy and I set it aside and I didn't really do much with it. But the manager of that retreat center started contacting me saying, that book that you were talking about, the 400th anniversary is coming up. You really ought to finish that book. So back about 2017, I guess, I got serious about doing some research on it. I hired a writing coach to help me write it. Actually, I won a half hour of his consultation time at a writer's conference. And then I cashed in on that half hour consultation and got some ideas from him about how to shape the story and how to put it together. And then I hired him mostly because in order for him to review what I was writing, I had to send him some information to review. So that kept me on track, kept me moving down the road. Then I went back to that same writer's retreat and got a lot of help from the people there to finish the book. So we rushed to get it done and out by early 2020, which turned out not to be necessary because all of the events around the celebration of the 400th anniversary were canceled or moved online because of the pandemic. And so that was a huge blow. For me personally, the low point of that was the summer of 2020. My younger brother and I had made arrangements to go to the large Brewster family reunion and meet a lot of cousins that we had never met before. We were really excited about that, and that event got canceled. So that was kind of a low point for me. But anyway, the book was about 7 years in the making. Along the way, I had a chance to go to England to do some research, and I had a chance to go to Holland and do some research. And then, of course, I've been to Plymouth, Massachusetts. It was called Plymouth Plantation. It's now called Plymouth Patuxent Living Museum in the Plymouth area. To do some research and lots of phone calls and email exchanges and lots of books.
So does your book actually change the way, history sees the Thanksgiving, I guess you could say?
Well, I hope so. One of the most important things that I like people to know is that there was a treaty in the spring of 1621. The Native Americans knew very well that these English people were there. They were watching them from afar. They were very suspicious of people from Europe because earlier people had come and to trade, but also to kidnap their young adults and haul them off to Europe to sell into slavery. We weren't taught that in school. And so they were watching them. They could see that they were really struggling, that they were starving, that they were burying people at a really good clip. So in the spring, they took matters into their own hands and came and called on the English and sat down and negotiated a treaty. In the course of my research, I met the descendants of the Native American leader who instigated that treaty. His name was Massasoit Usameguin. I interviewed them for the book. With some fear and trepidation, I asked them to review the book before it was published because I didn't want to add any further insult to the injury that the Native population had already suffered. So they took the manuscript. I waited many weeks for them to get back to me. They finally did, and they had a few changes to make, but nothing major. And then they agreed to move forward. And
that is super. Well, Kathryn, hold that thought for a minute because we want to know a little bit more about those Native Americans, or the Native Indians.
Yeah.
We'll be right back because our sponsors do have to have their time for their message.
They do.
Welcome to B4R.store, a bookstore for indie readers and indie authors, where indie authors can earn their fair share from the books you purchase. We have a wide variety of genres that you can select from. We also have ebooks and paperbacks. You can select authors by their first names, and we also have music. If you're interested in their city or country, we have that listed as well. If you are an author and would like to be on our bookstore, we have 3 options for you. There is a small minimal charge, or you can join our organization at authorsmarketing.org and learn how to better market and sell yourself. That is B4R.store, a bookstore for indie readers and indie authors.
Hi, I'm Charles Brakefield.
And I'm Rox Berkey.
Together, we write as Brakefield and Berkey.
Our techno thriller series is 12 books strong, with book 13, The Enigma Tracer, planned for 2022.
Techno thrillers are the cyber good guys versus today's darknet thugs.
We added our series prelude, Out of Poland, a 1939 historical novella, in 2021.
We also have 8 short stories available in family and women's contemporary genres, with more planned for 2022.
Please visit our website, enigmaseries.com, to learn more about why we say technology is today's weapon of choice. Thank you.
Welcome to the Indie Beacon Show, where readers can discover great new books by indie authors. Your hostess for today's show is Charlotte Cannon. We do hope you enjoyed today's show.
Well, this is Charlotte Canion, and we've been speaking with Kathryn Haueisen. I believe that's it. She said it's a German name and not anyone pronounces it right, but I'm trying to do my best. Kathryn, you were telling us a little bit about, the Native Americans and how they were relating to the Mayflower and the people that were, coming over from Europe. Give us a little more background of how they interacted, and you said that the treaty lasted 50 years. So what did they do to, help a treaty last that long? I don't know that we've seen one in my lifetime that lasts that long.
Well, there were 2 desperate cultures. The English had escaped from England back in 1608 for fear of their lives because they were nonconformist. And when Queen Elizabeth died and King James came to the throne, he had no tolerance for anybody challenging his authority over government or the church. And so their lives were in danger. So they made it to Holland and they stayed there for quite a while. But they really wanted to have their own place. And that was right as we were starting to set up colonies in the New World. Jamestown was already established. The Roanoke community had been attempted and failed. So they knew that this was possible. So they were determined to do it. But it was really rough. The trip lasted a lot longer than they thought it would. The conditions were rougher than they anticipated. They nearly ran out of food. They got sick. Half of them died. So they were in very desperate straits by the time they actually got to the New World and started establishing their settlement in what we call Plymouth, Massachusetts. Meanwhile, the Native Americans in that part of the world had their own problems. Earlier, traders and merchants and explorers had come and made contact with them. And with them, they brought fatal diseases. So the native population in the Massachusetts, Rhode Island area, 2/3 of them had died in a pandemic just a couple of years before the Mayflower showed up. The pandemic was much worse than what we were going through right now. I mean, it was horrible. They had no defense against the disease. They had no vaccinations. They had no hospitals. It was very, very rough. So when they saw these English coming with men and women and children and building supplies, they figured they're not here to trade. They're here to stay, and we have got to make this work. So they watched them from when they first dropped anchor in November of 1620 through to the spring of 1621. They were keeping an eye on them, but they were also staying pretty much out of sight. The English knew they were there because they could see their smoke fires and they could hear some of their activity, but they didn't have any face-to-face contact yet. Then in the spring of 1621, two Native Americans who both spoke English, one because he'd been involved with trading, the other because he was one of the people who got kidnapped, lived in England for a year and then made his way back as an interpreter. They came calling on the settlers and introduced themselves. And that led to them, their grand chief, a man called Massasoit Usameguin, coming to call on them and sit down and work out a treaty. They spent one whole afternoon doing it. And then life went on. They were mutually suspicious of each other, but they also knew that they needed each other. So the treaty had 7 points to it. The most important one is that if the English were in trouble, the natives would come and help them. If the natives were in trouble, the English would come and help them. And that when they went to visit one another, they would leave their weapons behind. They also agreed that if anyone from either party did something against the other one, the party that was offended would have the right to decide how to punish that person. So that was kind of a big deal. So there was an uneasy relationship between them, but it was workable. And then after about 50 years, the original leaders of the Pilgrims and the Native American people died, primarily of old age. The younger ones that coming along did not have the same desperate need to make this work. And the other factor was that from 1620 to all through the rest of the 1600s, there was a mass immigration of English people coming in by the thousands. And so just like today, when we are glad to welcome a few refugees, we take pity on them, we give them food and shelter and teach them English and all of that, that's fine. But when hordes of them show up, we become intimidated and threatened, and we want to put up barriers and say, that's enough, go back to your own country. The same thing was happening with the Native Americans towards the English. And so actually Massasoit Usameguin's son, who got the English name King Philip, he fired the first shot and it did not go well for him. Their culture was basically wiped out at that point in time. They were driven underground. The ones who survived were taken into slavery, and many of them sent down to the Bahamas and the Caribbeans, or they were put to forced labor in the New England area. But they kept their story alive through oral tradition for generations. In about the past quarter of a century or so, I would say, they have kind of been able to come out into the open. They are now officially networking with various entities in the New England area, particularly Roger Williams University. People are doing research to confirm their version of their oral history, and the tide is turning. So the relationships are getting much, much, much better.
Yeah, well, and your book is very timely. If you know they're in effect, you know, opening up the stories again, and
Yes.
you know, sharing what happened. You meant there was two things I wanted to touch on. How long did it take, you know, them to come over? How long were they on the ships?
A long time. They left Holland in July of 1620 on a ship called the Speedwell. They were to meet up with another ship, the Mayflower, in Southampton. Only 37 people on the Mayflower were part of the Pilgrim population that had been in exile in Holland. The rest of them were people that the adventurers who were financing this journey insisted they take with them, because the adventurers didn't think that they had the wherewithal to make a profit for them, which is they were in it for the money. So they foisted other people on, which turned out to be a really good thing. One of them was Captain Miles Standish. He was sort of their military escort. Another one was Stephen Hopkins, who had already been to the New World once before. He tried to come over to Jamestown and got shipwrecked in the Bahamas for 9 months, eventually made it to Jamestown, and then eventually made it back to Europe and came again on the Mayflower. So the Speedwell leaked. They left in July. They did not get very far. They turned around. They went back into port at Dartmouth. They repaired the Speedwell. They set out again. The Speedwell leaked. They went back into, this time, Plymouth, ironically, and decided they had to scrap the Speedwell. It just was not going to make the cross-Atlantic trip. So at that point, a few people said, this is enough fun for me, and went home. All the rest of them, 102 men, women, children, 2 dogs, maybe some other small animals, and all their worldly possessions, plus the crew of about 20 or 25 people had to fit in the Mayflower. 3 of those women were pregnant. I would love to have been a fly on the wall when that conversation was happening about, sweetheart, I've got this great idea. Why don't we go to the new world? Yeah. So they finally pushed off for the last time, either September 6th or the 16th. And it's not that we don't know which date it was, it's that we've changed the calendar since then. So it's very confusing trying to figure out what date to use. But I go with September 6th. You will also read September 16th. It took them 66 days to cross. They arrived at the tip of Cape Cod in the area that we now call Provincetown in November, I think November 9th. Dropped anchor, explored, took 3 expeditions to find the place where they were finally going to settle. All this time they're still on the ship because they have no shelter and it's winter. So they sailed across the bay, landed in the harbor of where they're going to set their settlement on December 25th, and got off the ship and got to work. It was not a holiday for them, it was a work day. Put up a few structures and finally got some of the men at least off of the ship. The last of the women got off the ship and probably not until February.
Wow. Well,
3 babies
Kathryn,
were born on the ship.
yeah, 3 babies born on the ship. Well, after this short commercial, we'll be right back with Kathryn.
Each and every one of us has a mission in life. Mine is to help people laugh through the good times and the bad. My name is Charlotte Canion, and I'm an author, a speaker, and a host on Indie Beacon Radio. If you need me to speak at an event or autograph my book, you can contact me at charlotte@charlottecanyon.com. Thank you, and have a blessed day.
Authors Marketing International, a membership-based organization where members learn how to better market and sell themselves. Join us at authorsmarketing.org. Welcome to the Indie Beacon Show, where readers can discover great new books by indie authors. Your hostess for today's show is Charlotte Cannon. We do hope you enjoyed today's show.
This is Charlotte Canion, and I'm interviewing Kathryn Haueisen. Oh, I'd really messed that one up. Anyway, Kathryn, you can say your name correctly and let our audience know how they can reach you if they need to have you come speak to their historical group or maybe libraries. Give us your website.
Okay, so first my last name, because it is complicated. My website is how, like how are you? Wise, like don't be a wise guy. Then, like then and there. howwiseden.com, which is a play on my very challenging last name of Haueisen. So you can reach me through there. I have been speaking all over the country. The one good thing out of the pandemic is it forced us all online. So I have spoken to libraries and genealogy groups and service clubs and book clubs from California to Ohio to Massachusetts to the Midwest. And so I'm happy to do that. I have presentations. I have pictures of what I call the Pilgrim Trail of the places that are part of the story. The book is published by Green Writers Press out of Vermont, and it's available wherever you can get books. If they don't have it, they can get it because it is available through all the traditional book outlets. And it's available in print form, ebook form, and audio form. The gal who did the audio version of it is a friend of mine, and she practiced British accents, so it would sound authentic when the British people are speaking. It was really amazing what she did. She's a professional opera singer in her former life and a very good public speaker. So it's a real treat to listen to her read the story to you.
That is so cool. Okay, one other thing that I would like to ask you to do is, you have extensive experience writing for magazines and newspapers and all. There are people that listen to this program and they have a book, because everyone has a book. but they don't really know how to get started. What kind of advice would you give them, in a couple of short sentences? What would you, how would you tell them to get started?
Well, first of all, if you want to be a writer, you have to write. So if you don't know how to write a book, then keep a journal and just document things that you experience every day and just practice writing. There are many excellent courses available online in this day and age. So you might just do a Google search for writing classes. And they are as short as 1 hour seminars to as long as 8 or 10 or 12 weeks. You do not have to pay a fortune for that. You can find something that will fit your budget. The other recommendation I would have is to find local writing groups where you live and strike up an acquaintance with some of the people in that group, maybe at first through some Facebook contact or some emails. And then maybe if they have meetings, get up the courage to go to one of them. Most writers really want to help other writers be successful. We don't really compete with one another like you might in some other industries, because there's just no limit to the amount of stories that can be told, and there's no limit to the amount of people who are reading books. So it's not a competition, and no two authors are the same and no two books are the same. So I would go find a local author or group of authors and hang out with them and start asking them for some wisdom.
And shouldn't they write maybe on what they have a passion for? That might be a start.
Yes, the common wisdom is write what you know about, but I'd also say write about what you care about, because I didn't know that much about the history of the Pilgrims before I started doing the research. I had a curiosity to know more about them, and I had the ability to read books and ask questions, but it wasn't a subject I was well versed in. I'd never written historical fiction before. I had to learn how to do that. So write what you're passionate about.
Yeah, makes sense. Well, Kathryn, thank you so much for being on the show. It's been a pleasure, and I look forward to reading your book. And for my listeners, I want you to remember one thing, that a rose is like a book. You can't know its beauty until you look at it. And a book is like a rose. You won't know its full beauty until you open it. And this is Charlotte Canion saying bye for now.
Thank you for watching the Indie Beacon Show, produced by B. Allen Bourgeois for the Authors Marketing International, LLC. Copyright 2022. Voiceover by B. Allen Bourgeois. If you would like to be a sponsor of the show, please contact us at authorsmarketing@outlook.com. If you would like to be on this show, it is free to authors. Simply fill out the form at indiebeacon.com. The music is provided by Happy Follows. The music is entitled